Welcome to Defenders, the teaching class of Dr. William Lane Craig. Today, Creation and Evolution, Part 19. For more resources from Dr. Craig, go online to reasonablefaith.org.
In our lessons, we've been thinking about the contemporary evolutionary paradigm, and we saw that one aspect of that paradigm is the affirmation of the thesis of common descent. And last time I said that in my assessment, it seemed to me that the evidence concerning the thesis of common descent was mixed, that while the genetic evidence seemed to support the idea of common descent, nevertheless, the fossil evidence seemed to still run against it. Is there any comment or discussion about this further before we look at that second aspect of the evolutionary paradigm, which is Darwinism, or the mechanisms of evolutionary development? Yes, over here, Jim.
I might have missed it, but I didn't hear anything in this whole genetic discussion. It seemed to me like the best argument for a common designer, because a designer is more likely, everything you look at in the world, you can generally tell if it has any importance to it at all. You can usually tell the designer, and once you know a designer's work, you can generally see characteristics of that designer's work in a long strain of devices or designs. Mm-hmm. For example, an architect might have a habit of putting this little space in, or this particular little feature in every house he designs or every building he designs. Yes. And that seems to me like what everything, all the evidence that you've given seems to me to be to support a central or a single designer.
I see. Okay. Well, this is, as I said last time, one possible way of responding to this genetic similarity among all living things is that this shows, as you say, a trait in the designer to design things a certain way. I do think, though, Jim, in all honesty, that response is less persuasive when it comes to what I shared about these pseudogenes, which are rather broken genes that have mutated in such a way as to become inoperative and no longer have their original function. And these get reproduced in organisms that are thought to have descended from earlier ones. And as I said, it would be hard to see why, for example, an automotive designer would reproduce, say, a broken jack from one model of a car that won't in fact jack the car up so that you can change the tire, why he would reproduce that broken jack in another model. When it comes to something like that, then it does seem to be, at least to my mind, indicative that this could be the result of some kind of a genetic relationship between the two, that the one is descended from the earlier one, and so these broken features get repeated. So while I think that's a possible response to the genetic similarity that we noted, it seems to me less persuasive with respect to these pseudogenes.
It seems like we've come a long way in genetics, but it seems still that we've got a long way to go. Yes. In that to say that we know what a gene does and doesn't do necessarily seems premature. I mean, just the whole realm of coding and communication and all that. Yes. It just seems there could be multiple levels of that within the DNA structure and everything. So to say absolutely that this is a broken gene may be presumptuous.
Yeah, I hear you. That's a good point. Certainly the discovery that junk DNA really has a function might be a lesson that would say we should be cautious about this. And then there are these master genes that simply switch others on and off that were discovered that previously were thought to be non-functional. So that could be grounds for caution. I think you're right. Yes, Brad.
I think we have to agree that the limitation of our knowledge says that similarity does not prove descent. Mm-hmm. And we can't say, aha, there it is, they're similar, so it proves descent. I think the argument on the other side is at least as powerful or more so, that there is a similarity. The only similarity is the similar designer. It's the same designer.
Okay. Yeah, that's basically similar to Jim's point. Yes, over here. Bruce?
Thank you. Dr. Craig, isn't there more to genetics, though, that than just the similarity of the genes, such as the addition of genetic information that would be necessary in order for one species to develop into another? And also, as far as genetics is concerned, shouldn't the naturalist be able to prove that mutations are a force for positive change within the organism, whereas it seems to the layman that most mutations are harmful?
All right, now let me say a couple of things in response. This isn't a debate between naturalists and theists. I don't think we want to frame it that way. We're looking at this from a theistic perspective, and we're asking, how did God bring about biological complexity? Did he use prior organisms as ancestors for ones that later developed, or are organisms created afresh, de novo? So this isn't a debate here between naturalism and theism, I think. But the other thing that I wanted to say is that I think the points that you're making about the deleterious effect of most mutations is really relevant to the third point that I want to talk about next, the explanatory mechanisms behind evolutionary change. And you're suggesting that these mechanisms are not explanatorily adequate because of what you mentioned, the overriding, debilitating effect of mutations. So I think that your point is really addressing what we're going to talk about rather than the thesis of common ancestry, which would just be that things that we observe today are descended from prior living organisms. Yes, David?
Following up on these pseudogenes, when Fuzz Reyna was here, I asked him about the pseudogenes.
Ah, good.
And so his comment was, yes, it certainly looks like common descent, but you do have to keep in mind this is an inference, and it's based on some assumptions. Yeah. And one assumption is that these genes really don't have a function, and maybe they do, sort of echoing what Donald said.
Was saying, yes.
And the other thing he pointed out, which was kind of interesting to me, is if you look at some of these pseudogenes, they have the same mutation that breaks them, and that makes it look like it comes from a common ancestor, and that broken change gets inherited. Fuzz was suggesting that it may be in some of these pseudogenes they have certain hot spots that make them more susceptible to mutations, and it may just be a coincidence that two different species had the same mutation, and that maybe that wouldn't be so unlikely.
Wow. Okay, well that would be a bold claim to write it off to just coincidence, but okay, I'm glad you asked him, and I wish I could have been at that session. Well, what is the evidence then for Darwinism, which you remember we defined as the claim or the thesis that natural selection operating on random mutations accounts for grand evolutionary change? Now, before we look at the evidence specifically, I think it's worth emphasizing how extraordinary an extrapolation Darwinism involves. Many of us probably think that if random mutation and natural selection could explain, say, the evolution of the horse from a small multi-toed animal up to the beautiful animal with a single hoof that we see today, that would really be powerful evidence for the efficacy of these Darwinian mechanisms. But in fact, evolution within a single kind like this is nothing compared to the vast range of life. Well, you might think that if we could show that random mutation and natural selection could explain, say, how a bat and a whale could evolve from a common ancestor, well, that would certainly show the power of these evolutionary mechanisms. Well, I want to invite you to think again. And here I want to have our first PowerPoint slide. On this slide, you see the various phyla, or major groups of the animal kingdom. Now, notice that top group, and that a bat and a whale are both mammals. And that's just one of the subcategories under the chordates. So that along with reptiles and birds, you have these mammals which belong to this single phylum of the chordates. So even the evolution of a bat and a whale from a common ancestor is an utter triviality compared to the vast range of the animal kingdom. This would do nothing to explain, for example, how a bat and a sea urchin, which you see belongs to another phylum, could evolve from a common ancestor, not to speak of a bat and a sponge, which is yet a more distant phylum. So that the extrapolation of these explanatory mechanisms from our limited experience to the sort of grand evolutionary story is an extrapolation of gargantuan proportions. And if this extrapolation takes your breath away, then take a look at the next slide. The whole previous slide that we just looked at showing the different phyla of the animal kingdom, all of that is contained on the little twig of that right-hand branch under eukarya where it says animals. Animals. I love the modesty of that label. The whole of the animal kingdom, all of those phyla that we previously saw, all of the diversity is contained on that little twig called animals. And notice slightly to the right of that twig is another twig labeled plants. Plants. The whole of the plant kingdom is contained in that little twig. And these are just two twigs on the branch of the eukaryotes, which are animals that have a cell or cells with a nucleus in them. There are still the two other domains of the bacteria and the archaea to be accounted for. The extrapolation of the efficacy of these Darwinian mechanisms from experiments on peppered moths and finch beaks and fruit flies to the production and evolution of every living thing is a breathtaking extrapolation of gargantuan, Brobdingnagian proportions. And we know that in science, such extrapolations often fail. To give an illustration from a field I'm familiar with, after Albert Einstein developed his special theory of relativity, in which he tried to eliminate absolute uniform motion in favor of simply relative motion, he attempted to enunciate a general principle of relativity that would also eliminate, or relativize rather, absolute rotation and acceleration, so that all motion, not simply uniform motion, but even rotational and accelerated motion, would also be relativized to reference frames. But in fact, this extrapolation failed. He was unable to successfully enunciate a general principle of relativity that would eliminate absolute rotation and acceleration. Instead, what he discovered was a radical new theory of gravity, which was his greatest achievement. The general theory of relativity is not really a relativistic theory in the sense of eliminating absolute acceleration and rotation. It's a gravitational theory that enunciates a new theory of gravity to replace Newton's theory. So in fact, although Einstein had limited success in the special theory in eliminating absolute uniform motion, it turned out that that principle could not be extrapolated so as to relativize all motion. And similarly, we are compelled to ask, I think, in the case of these mechanisms of random mutation and natural selection, what is the evidence for this extraordinary extrapolation from the limited development that we see through mutation and natural selection to the grand evolutionary scenario? Well, typical of the evidence that is offered on behalf of these Darwinian mechanisms are things like the experience of breeders in breeding new kinds of roses, for example, or horses. The experiments with the peppered moths in England, in which the light and dark moths varied in their proportion of the moth population based upon the amount of industrial pollution that darkened the trees in England. And then the development on the part of bacteria to drugs, the mutations that cause bacteria to become drug resistant, so that we have to develop new drugs to fight these because they've mutated in such a way as to become resistant to the drugs that we have. Well, let me say a word about each of these. Francisco Ayala, whom I quoted before, prominent evolutionary biologist, appeals to the experience of breeders in producing new varieties of dogs and roses, for example, as evidence for the efficacy of these mechanisms of random mutation and natural selection. But I think you can see clearly that such experience does nothing to justify the extrapolation of these mechanisms to the production of the grand evolutionary story of life. In fact, quite the contrary. The experience of breeders tends to show the limits of these mechanisms, in that the breeders bump up against limits beyond which they cannot produce desired variety. For example, despite decades of effort, breeders have never been able to get chickens to lay more than one egg per day. So that breeding actually shows the limits of what natural selection and random mutation can accomplish. Ayala also appeals to the famous peppered moth experiments. But all that happened in that case was that the proportion of light-colored moths in the population decreased, and the proportion of dark-colored moths increased. But the light-colored moths never evolved into dark-colored moths. So that, taken as evidence of the power of natural selection and random mutation to produce grand evolutionary change, honestly, to call such evidence paltry would be to pay it an undue compliment. Ayala also appeals to the finch beaks of different sizes that Darwin observed in his visit to the Galapagos Islands. But again, like the peppered moths, nothing here ever actually evolved. It's just that the proportion of finches with the large beaks increased during the drought or the dry season. They were better able to survive. And the proportion with the small beaks decreased because they were less able to survive in the dry climate. But once the rains came again, then the normal beak proportions in the finch population returned as the population increased. Ayala also mentions the speciation that occurs in fruit flies in Hawaii. And this is a very interesting case. The Hawaiian Islands are extremely isolated, and so they tend to be sealed off from outside influences. And that's why there are no indigenous mammals, for example, in Hawaii. And yet, some 500 species of fruit flies exist in the Hawaiian Islands. 1/4 of all of the fruit fly species that exist in the entire world. There are about 2,000 in the entire world. And fully 1/4 of these exist in this tiny area on the Hawaiian Islands. And this evidence points to their common ancestry and evolution as they have mutated and evolved into a diversity of species. And I think we can agree that this evidence, in all plausibility, points to their common ancestry and evolution, and agree that this is well within the limits of what these Darwinian mechanisms can achieve. But again, it hardly goes to justify the enormous extrapolation of the power of these mechanisms to yield the grand evolutionary scenario. All we have here is just speciation of fruit flies in the islands. Finally, Ayala appeals to the ability of organisms to develop drug resistance and resistance to poisons through random mutation and selection. And he points out how an unacceptably improbable double mutation, where a mutation would need to occur simultaneously at two places in the genetic structure, how this can happen one step at a time. So that while it's unacceptably improbable to say that you could have a double mutation simultaneously, nevertheless, it can be achieved stepwise to produce cumulative change, such as producing drug-resistant bacteria. And then he extrapolates this process to explain macroevolutionary change. But of course, the question that we're asking here is, can the mechanisms be successfully extrapolated in that way? Well, in his most recent book, The Edge of Evolution, Michael Behe argues that the very evidence of organisms' development of drug resistance is a powerful indication of the limits of what random mutation and natural selection can achieve with regard to evolutionary change. For example, Behe explains that malaria and the human immune system have been waging war against each other for over 10,000 years. Since the advent of modern science, human beings have been developing anti-malarial drugs to try to destroy the malarial organism. Unfortunately for us, the malarial population is huge. The average person infected with malaria has over 1 trillion malaria cells in his body. And therefore, malaria mutates extremely rapidly. And as a result, it's been able to develop resistance to every drug that we've thrown at it. Simple, single-point mutations are enough to make malaria drug resistance. For example, Behe says a mutation in one amino acid at point 108 in the human genome suffices to render malaria drug resistance to pyrimethamine. On the other side, there's enormous selective pressure on the human immune system to develop some sort of defense against malaria. But it hasn't done so. The human immune system has not been able to develop a defense or evolve a defense against malaria. Instead, what has happened, says Behe, is that a mutation has occurred in the human respiratory system. Not in the immune system. There's been a mutation in our respiratory system which makes some people immune to malaria, namely sickle cell hemoglobin. Unfortunately, the downside is that this also produces sickle cell anemia, which is eventually deadly. Now, this is where the story gets really interesting. Despite its incredible mutation rate that has enabled malaria to overcome every drug that we've hurled at it, malaria has never, in all of those thousands of years and trillions of mutations, has never been able to overcome sickle hemoglobin. Molecular biology explains why. Resistance to a drug can result from a simple single-point mutation. But overcoming sickle hemoglobin would require either multiple simultaneous mutations or else a sequence of mutations occurring blindly, which are just too improbable to occur. And as a result, sickle hemoglobin has never been overcome by malaria. The mutations required are simply too improbable. HIV supplies another case study. The HIV virus mutates 10,000 times faster than malaria, if you can imagine. In the last 50 years alone, the AIDS virus has mutated as much as all the cells that have ever existed upon Earth. Can you imagine? In the last 50 years, the HIV virus has mutated as much as all the cells that have ever existed on Earth. It has tried out every possible combination of up to 6-point simultaneous mutations, and it's become resistant to every drug that we've developed. But, Behe says, and I quote, through all of that, there have been no significant basic biochemical changes in the virus at all. On a functional biochemical level, the virus has been a complete stick in the mud. Behe concludes, and I quote, the studies of malaria and HIV provide by far the best direct evidence we have of what Darwinism can do. He says, we have here genetic studies over thousands upon thousands of generations of trillions and trillions of organisms and little of biochemical significance to show for it. Our experience with HIV and malaria gives good reason to think that Darwinism doesn't do much, even with billions of years and all the cells in the world at its disposal. Finally, recent studies on the bacterium E. coli have yielded similar results. Richard Lenski and his colleagues recently released their data on studies of E. coli, in which they did research on 40,000 generations of E. coli grown in the laboratory. They discovered that while there were a couple score of beneficial mutations, and this speaks to Bruce's point, there were a couple score beneficial mutations that occurred in these E. coli bacteria. Nevertheless, these mutations were degradative or degenerative in nature. That is to say, they involved the loss of genetic information or the loss of protein function. They were beneficial, but they resulted from the loss of genetic information. So there's no indication that these bacteria were on their way toward building new complex systems. So Lenski's work lines up very well with the results of malarial and HIV findings. In huge numbers of tries, one sees minor changes, mostly degradative, but no new complex systems evolve. Now, malaria, HIV, and E. coli represent three fundamentally different forms of life. The malarial organism is a eukaryote. That is to say, it's an organism having a nucleus. HIV is a virus. E. coli is a bacterium. It's a prokaryote. They don't have a nucleus. So we have here three fundamentally different forms of life, a eukaryote, a virus, and a prokaryote. And in each case, the evidence for the efficacy of the Darwinian mechanisms is the same. It just doesn't do very much. I quote from Michael Behe's online blog. Instead of imagining what the power of random mutation and selection might do, we can look at the examples of what it has done. And when we look at the best, clearest examples, the results are, to say the least, quite modest. Time and again, we see that random mutations are incoherent and much more likely to degrade a genome than to add to it. And these are the positively selected beneficial random mutations. He says there is no evidence the Darwinian processes can take the multiple coherent steps needed to build new molecular machinery that fills the cell. Thus, the evidence from, or the argument from the ability of organisms to develop drug resistance seems to completely backfire, far from providing evidence of the power of the Darwinian mechanisms to produce grand evolutionary change. The experience of scientists with drug resistance in bacteria and viruses and malaria reveals the severe limits of those mechanisms. So, again, I ask, where is the evidence for the extraordinary extrapolation that Darwinism involves? B, he says that the evidence for common descent seems compelling. So he affirms the thesis of common descent that we looked at. The evidence for common descent seems compelling. But, he says, except at life's periphery, the evidence for a pivotal role for random mutations is terrible, end quote. Now, if B, he is wrong about this, then I simply want to know, what's the evidence? I'm genuinely open to it, but what is it? What is the evidence that would justify this grand evolutionary extrapolation? So I have to say, when I, as an objective observer, look at the evidence, it seems to me that we haven't been shown yet any good reason to think that these Darwinian mechanisms are sufficient to explain the extraordinary diversity of life that we see on this planet during the amount of time that is available. In their book, The Anthropic Cosmological Principle, the physicists John Barrow and Frank Tipler list 10 steps in the course of human evolution, such as the development of photosynthesis, the development of an endoskeleton, and so forth. 10 steps in the course of human evolution, each of which is so improbable that before it would occur, the sun would cease to be a main sequence star and would incinerate the earth. Included in these steps are things like the development of a DNA-based genetic code, the evolution of aerobic respiration, the evolution of glucose fermentation to pyruvic acid, the development of an endoskeleton, and so on and so forth. 10 steps in the course of human evolution, each of which is so improbable that before it would occur, the sun would have gone through the entire course of its stellar evolution and incinerated the earth. And as a result, they report, and I quote, "There has developed a general consensus among evolutionists that the evolution of intelligent life, comparable in information processing ability to that of Homo sapiens, is so improbable that it is unlikely to have occurred on any other planet in the entire visible universe." So according to Baron Tipler, the consensus of the evolutionary biologists themselves is that the evolution of intelligent life is so improbable it's unlikely to have taken place anywhere else in the entire visible universe. But then that raises the obvious question: why think that it has evolved on this planet by these Darwinian mechanisms? Indeed, doesn't the evidence suggest just the opposite? In fact, Tipler himself now believes that the process of evolution must have been guided by some kind of intelligence. So, how do we put this together? Well, I'm rather skeptical of these mechanisms of the Darwinian theory of biological evolution. I think the whole story hasn't been told here yet, and so that even if the thesis of common ancestry is true, these mechanisms that have thus far been suggested seem to be inadequate to explain the biological complexity that we have today. There's something more going on here than just random mutation and natural selection. Well, with that, we're out of time, so we'll come back to this story next week and begin with any questions or discussion that you might want to have about the efficacy of these mechanisms.
The copyright for the content of this recording is held by Dr. William Lane Craig. For more, go to reasonablefaith.org.